Rashford won, government nil. The footballer who took on coronavirus food poverty and won. This is Coronavirus, the latest from The Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis. Premier League football might be on hold for just one day longer, but there's one footballer who's been working on an entirely different goal. More than 1 million schoolchildren will be given vouchers for free school meals over the summer, following pressure from cross-party MPs and Manchester United and England forward Marcus Rashford. The 22-year-old wrote an open letter to MPs urging them to reverse their decision not to award free school meal vouchers in England outside of term time, a move he said would have had a serious impact on communities like his, squeezed even before the worst recession in living memory.
You know, my mum was a single parent. She's got 5 kids that was all living in the same house, and not only so she's working very hard to put food on the table, and then it's the stress on the shoulders that affected her after we've ate our dinner, because she knows she's worrying about the situation. She's trying to go to sleep but she can't because she's so worried, and then the next day 8 o'clock she gets up, gets on the bus and starts the day again, and this was every single day on her to try and feed five kids. And you know, she was part of programs like that like food vouchers and stuff like that.
On Monday, the Prime Minister rejected the plea, but come Tuesday, a different story.
I talked to Marcus Rashford today and congratulated him on his campaign, in which, to be honest, I only became aware of very, very recently today. And I do think it's right that we should be looking after families of the vulnerable, most vulnerable, the neediest right now, and that's why we've got the COVID summer food plan, which we've announced today.
The new COVID Summer Food Fund will cost around £120 million in additional funding. The change in policy fends off what was widely seen as an expected Tory MP rebellion when MPs were set to vote on the issue on Tuesday in what could have been an embarrassing own goal. Reacting to the news, the footballer said, "Just look at what we can do when we come together. This is England in 2020. To discuss the U-turn, I spoke to the Telegraph's Northern football correspondent James Ducker, and I started by asking him to tell us more about the man behind the campaign.
So Rashford is one of the country's most exciting young footballers. He's a 22-year-old striker for Manchester United and England. He joined United as a young boy, came through their development centres from sort of the age of 8, right through, and then had this sort of meteoric rise. He was thrust into the first team in 2016 under the former manager Louis van Gaal due to a serious injury crisis up front, and ended up scoring twice. And Rashford, you know, who was only, I think, 18 at the time, and he's never really looked back since then. It's, there's obviously been challenges along the way, but he's sort of firmly established as one of Europe's most exciting young forwards now. And
if you didn't know Marcus Rashford before the lockdown, you might have got to know him during, because he's been busy, hasn't he?
He's been very busy, but he's been working towards this for a while. So, I mean, for those who are unaware, he partnered with a food distribution charity called Fair Share, with the target of trying to raise £100,000 for vulnerable children who basically won't get enough meals during the lockdown. I think he contributed something like £60,000 initially himself to that. And this was not tokenism or just a sort of a desire to attach his name to something. He threw everything he had behind it and ended up raising over £20 million in counting. Wow. And through that money, they're now feeding 3 million vulnerable people every week.
Those are astounding figures. What's made Marcus Rashford so passionate about this cause in particular?
Well, I mean, he's from tough inner city area in Manchester called Wythenshawe. Well, Northern Moor and Wythenshawe. He grew up in the two areas. He's one of 5 children, and his mum, Melanie, worked full time, often several jobs, but all for minimum wage. And he himself was dependent on free school meals, food banks, soup kitchens. It wasn't unusual for the family to get the Christmas dinners from food banks. You know, I have had the pleasure of knowing some of the Rashford family members for a while now, and they are very, very passionate about being able to give back and do something. And by that, not just by writing a cheque, but by actually seriously throwing their weight behind things that they believe in. And he'd been doing things before the partnership with Fair Share. I mean, he'd started this thing called the In the Box campaign, which teamed up with the Selfridges store in Manchester to feed a lot of homeless people in Manchester during the Christmas period. The city has had a serious problem on that front, and then there's been various initiatives.
James, clearly this has been on Marcus Rashford's radar for quite some time. He's been doing some great work in this space, but what has happened is that it's come onto our radars very quickly, and indeed, much more importantly, onto ministers' radars very quickly. And even on Tuesday morning, you had ministers rejecting calls for free school meals over the holidays. Yet by Tuesday afternoon, you've got the Prime Minister saying he's spoken to Marcus Rashford and congratulating him on the campaign. So it has been quite a quick turnaround once it reached the kind of ministerial corridors. What do you think it is about this campaign? Do you think it's the personal aspect that has really caught people's attention?
I think that story, I think the personal element of it has resonated with a huge number of people. And I think when you get people like Therese Coffey, the Working Pensions Secretary, this morning sort of flippantly responding to Rashford, call on people just to take a moment to think that when they make the cereal this morning, what it's like for those families who got to choose which meal they're going to have that day because they can't afford to have three. They might have to wait until, do they have breakfast, or do we wait till the evening and eat so we don't go to bed hungry? For her to respond with sort of a flippant remark, I think she said, water cannot be disconnected, though. I think he made a point about spare a moment for those whose water might be cut off. I mean, I've read quite a lot saying that's a bad look. I'm not sure it's a bad look. I mean, what sort of person reads those tweets and that's the first thought that comes into their head? I found it. I mean, if we're talking about she's talking about water being disconnected. If we're talking about a disconnect, I mean, there we have it. I'm sure there's plenty of Tory MPs who are very quick to offer their support to Rashford's campaign who are embarrassed.
There's kind of two sides to this. Cynics would say that they were forced into a U-turn because this afternoon Labour was due to force a vote on the issue in the House of Commons, and we knew that the Tories were risking a rebellion from some of their backbenchers. But as you say, there's the other side of this, and maybe U-turn's the wrong word in this case, because if it's a welcome U-turn, maybe it's just a change of heart, and there's so many politics around the phrase.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of people couldn't care less what words used to describe it: U-turn, about turn, change your heart. I think what's frustrating for people is that Downing Street came out yesterday and effectively said no, whereas I think people would probably have preferred that they actually took even maybe another 24 hours to actually carefully consider it, crunch the numbers, look at everything, and then come back. It seemed a little bit quick, and now 24 hours later they've reneged on that. I think that's not a particularly great look, but I think the most important thing is that they have listened and they have responded. And
we normally associate football with big paychecks, fame, valuable television rights. How common is it for individual footballers to use their public profile to campaign for causes close to their heart, those living in poverty or otherwise?
I mean, this has become quite a topical issue during the lockdown. I think triggered in part by Matt Hancock coming out in early April and calling on footballers to play their part. And I think quite a lot of footballers at that time felt it was an attempt to draw attention away from the testing crisis that was going on. And I think a lot of people have found it very interesting that, government ministers haven't been calling out hedge fund managers or chief executives of major companies and everything else, calling for them to play their part. And I think it does a few things. I think I've been a football journalist for almost 20 years now, and there are a substantial number of players who do an awful lot of charity and community work. They just don't seek publicity. There are absolutely a significant number of footballers out there who do a lot of work. I think what's interesting is we often hear it said that footballers should use their wealth and their status for the greater good, and we've seen it with Rashford even in recent days, and certainly with Raheem Sterling, when they actually look to use that status and their position to try and bring about change beyond football. People shout them down and say, remember your place. Well, I think the likes of Sterling and Rashford, who are not just young footballers, but are young black footballers with very increasingly influential voices, are being heard now. And I think they've probably been ignored for too long. And, we talk a lot about the issue, but we don't see enough change. And I think people like that being prepared, willing to put their voice to such important matters is a huge sort of step forward. And I think Rashford and Sterling are symbols of a new generation that we should embrace.
It's their voice, their experience, first-hand experience, and their large social media presence too. And I think a government that overlooks that these days is missing a trick.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what's nice to see, there has to be a place for a bit of fun on social media, and and that's great, and they can have a laugh and a joke. But they also use they are also using that platform for good and to bring about change and awareness. And you mentioned Rashford's age there; he's 22. I think it's very easy to forget. I think we could all look back at what we were like at 22 and think,
Let's not.
Well, no, exactly. It's quite remarkable.
The rest of the coronavirus latest news. The world's first coronavirus treatment that significantly reduces the risk of death is being given to NHS patients following trials by British scientists. The common steroid dexamethasone was shown to radically improve the chances of survival for the most ill patients. Boris Johnson described it as the biggest breakthrough yet in coronavirus treatment globally. The UK government's been stockpiling the drug and has supplies for 200,000 patients. Beijing's ordered the closure of all of the capital's schools as authorities attempt to contain an outbreak of the virus. The reintroduction of lockdown measures follows the discovery of 106 cases in the Chinese capital since last Thursday. Residents in high-risk neighbourhoods have been sealed inside their housing compounds, while those in medium-risk areas are banned from leaving the city. More than 600,000 Britons lost their jobs in the first 2 months of the lockdown. The figures were revealed as part of the Office for National Statistics' latest report on the UK labour market. In signs of a growing unemployment crisis, hours worked dropped 9%, benefits claimed surged to 2.8 million, and vacancies continued to plunge. This is Coronavirus, the latest from The Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis. Subscribe to this feed to stay updated on all the key issues around the coronavirus. For all the latest sports news, health updates, and analysis of the fast-moving political situation, head to telegraph.co.uk/audio, where listeners can get a free 30-day subscription to The Telegraph online. If you find this podcast useful, please do leave it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. And if you want to get in touch, the address is coronaviruspodcast@telegraph.co.uk.